if I can say it again, I'm very, very honored to give my first speech as President of the ECB here in Berlin. You, Hans, recalled the many times that we had worked together. I will never forget them. They were very difficult times in the early 90s, 92, 91, the budget deficit to GDP ratio, 11%, debt to GDP ratio, 120%, inflation rate about 7–8%, social unrest, the legacy of the Red Brigades here and there, an entire generation of political class wiped out by the scandals. Talking about Italy, of course. And then in all this, we underwrote the Maastricht Treaty. And around that table, Hans was there, former President Horst Köhler, Jean-Claude Trichet, myself, and few others. Very few are now in this around the tables that I have to attend to. And around that table, the first seeds of what would become a pact, more than a currency, a pact based on trust, were planted. And what we've been doing, there is one way to characterize much of what all of us have been doing since then. One would say, regardless of the technical things, one would say that much of what we've been done and what we are doing today is geared, is oriented, aims at rebuilding this trust, strengthening this trust. And it's a trust amongst the policymakers, it's a trust of the citizens of some countries towards the other countries, it's a trust of citizens towards their political governments. And so I remember clearly the experience of Italy leaving the ERM in '92, and I can quote many other things. Just let me say that you know, when I settled in my new office, I had some pictures, some photographs with me, and one photograph that I showed to you, Hans, last time you came to visit the ECB, shows Hans and me shaking hands. In the midst, we have Carlo Azeglio Ciampi, then finance minister. And this was 1997 or 98, when I was dispatched by Carlo Azeglio Ciampi to tour Europe to convince people that people of Europe, the Hans Stittmeyer in Germany, that Italy could make it and should be welcome in the Euro construct. But of course, without Carlo, my own role would have not been enough. And let me recall him as an essential protagonist, actor of that process. Let me also express my gratitude to the Ludwig-Erhard Foundation, whose activities in support of the principles of soziale Marktwirtschaft are renowned across Europe. Ludwig-Erhard's legacy in shaping Germany's post-war recovery stretches far beyond his own country and far beyond his own times. His conception of the social market economy was visionary, and he even held, as you recalled a moment ago, Hans, even held cherished views about central bankers, which, by the way, it's a rarity, stressing the importance of price stability. Die soziale Marktwirtschaft ist ohne eine konsequente Politik der Preisstabilität nicht denkbar. I think we cannot formulate this idea any better today. Ludwig-Erhard also helped to enshrine the principle of central bank independence. When in the early 1950s the independence of the German central bank system was not yet settled, he, as Hans said a moment ago, the Minister of the Economy argued that the government should not issue instructions to the central bank. We inherited in the statutes of the ECB this important principle. And again, I would like to recall Hans's role, Professor Tittmeyer's role, in making sure that the text of the Maastricht Treaty would contain these provisions, which was not to be taken as granted. Was actually, if one counts them, it was a minority position around that table, which fortunately prevailed. Current circumstances remain demanding, with economic, financial, and fiscal issues deeply intertwined with challenges at the political level in many countries and in the supranational European sphere. Last week, 2 sets of important decisions have been taken, and they are the focus of my remarks today. There is a set of monetary policy measures, and there is, I would say, an event which took place in the European Council Summit with the decisions that it took and that brought some, what I judge to be very important new elements to our economic and monetary union. Let me first, in trying to explain the monetary policy decisions of the ECB last week, let me recall first the particular role of banks in the euro area economy. Differently from other financial jurisdictions like, for example, the US, the flow of credit to firms and households in the euro area works largely through banks. If I'm not mistaken, about 80% of the credit is given by the banking system to households and firms in Europe. In the US, the comparable figure is around 30–35%. During recent years, about 3/4 of firms' external financing had come from that source. This means that an impairment of the credit channel, of the bank lending channel, will have much stronger consequences in the euro area than in other economies. Now, banks in recent times have come under strong pressure because of 2 reasons: lack of capital and lack of funding. Let me first dwell with the lack of capital, where there is certainly a plan to strengthen their capital basis. And this is an attempt to, in a sense, strengthen as well their stance in financial markets. But it's not an easy process, because there are essentially, banks face 3 options with respect to their capital levels. The first is simply the simplest, which is to raise capital. But that's not easy. In the present market conditions, capital is very expensive, and the existing shareholders are reluctant because they don't want to be diluted. So banks are actually facing a market which is not favorable to raising capital. The second option is to basically sell assets. But again, it's not easy to sell assets nowadays at reasonable price. So the risk of having what we call fire sales is there. And the third option, unfortunately, is to reduce lending. Now, obviously, this is the worst option of all. So this is the background against which we have to look and explain the monetary policy decisions. Now, but there are also funding pressures. Just to give you an idea, in the first quarter of next year, just in the first quarter of next year, 230 billion euros of bank bonds come due in the euro area. If you add to this something like 250 billion of government bonds coming due at about the same time, and also some corporate debt, which is the new thing now, that comes due in the form of assets that were actually the legacy of the crisis, also that comes due. And it's very unlikely that this corporate debt is going to be underwritten again, certainly not in the form it had before. So the funding pressure will be there for, I would say, banks, but also corporates. Also, we are observing that stable sources of funding are decreasing for the banking system, and wholesale funding is also seriously weakened. As a reaction to this, banks are shortening their borrowing and are also shortening or reducing their lending. But we also observe that there are shortages of collateral that the banks can bring to the ECB for borrowing money from the ECB. So in addition to identifying these particular strains in the banking sector, a regular economic and monetary analysis has indicated that these intensified financial market tensions continue to dampen economic activity in the euro area. And the overall outlook remains subject to high uncertainty, in fact higher than a month ago, and to substantial downside risks. In such an environment, cost pressures, wage pressures, and price pressures in the euro area should remain modest over our relevant horizon. And at the same time, we have observed that the underlying pace of monetary expansion remains subdued. So in these conditions, and faithful to our mandate to maintain price stability over the medium term, the ECB's Governing Council has taken a number of far-reaching decisions last week. First, we decided to reduce our key interest rate by another 25 basis points after the reduction we had last month. The policy rate is now 1%. Now, normally, in normal financial conditions, a reduction in the policy rate is a potent instrument for both controlling inflation, if it's an increase in interest rate, and to support demand and growth. Now, the rate cut translates itself to the economy through a long chain of adjustments in all the financial returns. At the end of the process, the yield on a large spectrum of securities declines because we've reduced the rates and promotes broad-based policy accommodation. But in the present conditions, this process is somewhat hampered, so that the impact of a rate cut by itself is weakened. Banks limit their lending to other banks and potentially to the broader economy, and they hold on to precautionary balances of cash as self-insurance. To give you an idea, the ECB has created in the last, I would say, throughout the last year, a very significant amount of liquidity, very significant. And where does it go? Well, at this point, we observed that the so-called deposit facility with the ECB now is at the same level as it was after Lehman Brothers. So it means that banks take this liquidity and then redeposit it with the ECB, even though it's costly for them to do so. But that's why that's because of the search for what we call safe haven. So as an additional measure to fight against this heightened risk aversion, the Governing Council decided on 3 other measures, each of which provides additional support in order to bring the necessary monetary policy impulse to the real economy. The current package, we believe, should be felt tangibly in the financial sector and by households and firms over the coming weeks and months. Of course, it comes against strong winds of deleveraging that I mentioned before. It comes against strong winds whereby banks are actually reducing their lending or try desperately to raise their capital ratios. We established very long-term refinancing operations with a maturity of 3 years. Now, this duration is a novelty in ECB monetary policy. It basically means that banks can borrow from the ECB with the 3 years maturity. The extension of central bank credit provision to very long maturities would give to banks a longer horizon in their liquidity planning. It helps them to avoid rebalancing the maturities of their assets and liabilities through a downscaling of long-term lending. In other words, if banks have to borrow short, especially after the crisis, they can't be expected to lend long. because they would have a maturity mismatch and would be highly risky. That's what they used to do before the crisis, but they learned not to do it. Now, if they have no funding, what they would do, they would cut long-term lending. What we are trying to do with these facilities now is to enable banks to lend long. Incidentally, we want to make it absolutely clear that in the present conditions, where systemic risk is seriously hampering the functioning of the economy, we see no stigma attached to the use of central banking credit provisions. Our facilities are there to be used. Banks will be able to refinance term lending with the euro system and thus preserve their long-term exposures to the real economy. After the first year, banks will have the option to terminate the operation, so they can flexibly adapt to changing liquidity conditions and normalizing market environment. Our second measure will allow banks to use loans as collateral with the euro system. Because what's happened now is that especially small banks and medium-sized banks are short of collateral. And these banks are the ones who mostly finance SMEs, small and medium-sized companies. So we have an overall credit tightening, but we think there is a special credit tightening in that segment of the financial system, in that segment of the firms. And so what we did was trying to address this lack of collateral, broadening the choice of guarantees that banks have to bring to the ECB for borrowing from the ECB. Of course, we have to screen the collateral carefully so as to protect our balance sheet. The third measure we announced last week was to reduce the required reserve ratio from 2% to 1%. And this measure by itself frees up liquidity for the banking sector for an additional 100 billion euros. You will notice that I referred repeatedly to small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, the reason for drawing your attention on this segment of the industry is that they altogether account for about 60% of the employment in the euro area and about 40% of the overall turnover. On top of this, one would say the large corporates have more or less maintained most of their access to the credit system because they are able to issue bonds. They can access capital markets, not so small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, let me now shift my attention to last week's European Council summit, which has attracted comments that I think were more negative than it actually deserved. For more than 12 years, Europe's economic and monetary union has been haunted by concerns about national budgets. Within a common currency area during normal times, the fiscal policies of individual countries typically face less pressure from financial markets. We should spend a minute going over the experience of these 10 years until the Lehman crisis. We had countries with very different initial conditions. We had countries with huge debt and countries with small debt. We had countries which grew with some growth or with a lot of growth, and countries with zero growth. No matter what the interest rates would be, these countries would not grow and have not grown, and so on and so forth. Now, you would have expected that the spreads between the government bonds of different countries would have reflected this difference in initial conditions and this difference in economic policies, which were quite deviant between countries. The answer is no. Spreads undershot, as we say, these differences. Spreads didn't reveal the different riskiness of the different countries' bonds. Now, with the crisis, the risk aversion had gone up, and it increased the risk perception of the markets, and in a sense revealed this lack of signal by the spreads. And so spreads now are overshooting this difference. But we should be aware that the difference in spreads is bound to stay because it reveals differences, as I said before, in initial conditions and policies. So we ought to be realistic here. Some of this is positive, is a positive development. But basically, fiscal discipline would in a one currency area, fiscal discipline had shown the tendency to be weakened at the very beginning, since the very beginning. It was for this reason that the Stability and Growth Pact was established to provide a control mechanism for fiscal policy. Next year, the euro area as a whole will have a government primary budget deficit close to zero, which compares well with the primary deficits of 5% of GDP in Japan, UK, and US. Yet, the implementation of the Fiscal and Growth Pact has not been good enough. As the Federal Chancellor of Germany recently remarked, the pact has been broken 60 times over the past 12 years. So we clearly have work to do to prevent this happening again. Now, the new set of rules for economic and fiscal surveillance known as the six-pack, which was approved by the European Parliament earlier this year, will certainly strengthen the implementation of these rules. But while these changes were being planned, the entire fiscal cohesion and credibility of the euro was weakened. We've now begun the process of redesigning Europe's fiscal framework on three fronts. The first lies with the countries concerned. I will never be tired of saying that the first response ought to emanate from the countries. There is no external savior for a country that doesn't want to save by itself. So the first response is should come from national governments. These policies, the national policies, have to be put back on a sound footing. I believe that they are now on the right track, and they are very right in implementing budget consolidation resolutely. Now, it's clear that there is going to be a short-term contraction. Again, one has to be realistic. Now, this could be partly mitigated by the returning confidence that a better budgetary policy would inspire to markets. But in the medium term, there is only one way to achieve sustainable growth, and this is only by undertaking deep structural reforms that most countries in the euro area have procrastinated for too long. The second pillar of a response to the crisis, however, consists in a redesign of the fiscal governance in the euro area, what I call the fiscal compact. That is to say, a fundamental restatement of the rules to which national budgetary policies ought to be subject so as to gain credibility beyond doubt. Last week's summit committed to enshrine these rules in the primary legislation. These rules will foresee that the annual structural deficit should not exceed 0.5% of nominal GDP. Euro area member states will implement such rule in their national legal frameworks at the constitutional level, so that it's possible to avoid excessive deficits before they arise, rather than trying to control them after they have emerged. Prevention is better than cure. Rules will also foresee an automatic correction mechanism in case of deviation. Moreover, the leaders agreed on a numerical benchmark for annual debt reduction to bring down debt levels. They also agreed to sanctions that will apply automatically to euro area member states in breach of 3% reference value for deficits. And the European Court of Justice may be asked to verify the transposition of these rules at the national level. So, I would say, taken together, I believe these decisions will be capable of making public finances in the euro area credibly robust. So, for the first time, we'll be having ex ante binding legislation, and then, of course, we'll have also the ex post control by the Commission through the various six-packs and Stability and Growth Pact projects. But it's not enough. To restore financial markets' confidence, it's also required that investors be reassured that government debt will always be repaid and timely serviced. Greece will remain a unique instance. and a credible stabilization mechanism, what now is being called by almost everybody a firewall, will be in place and can be activated when needed, subject to proper conditionality. The leaders unambiguously agreed to assess the adequacy of this firewall by next March. Its objective is to address the threats to financial stability and especially the risk of contagion between different sovereign debt markets. I said before that the spreads are overshooting now. Now, when you have spreads that are overshooting and a very high volatility, you have an increase in what's called counterparty risk, and the probability of accidents increases. We want to avoid accidents at this point in time, and that's why a firewall like this could be essential. The leaders also decided to deploy the leveraging of the EFSF at the earliest opportunity, and they also agreed that the successor to the EFSF, the ESM, would enter into force by July 2012. Now, it's crucial that the EFSF be fully equipped and operational as soon as possible, and that's why the leaders entrusted the ECB with the task of acting as an agent for the EFSF, where the ECB will deploy its technostructure to make sure that this comes into operation very soon. Let me conclude. The decisions of the European Council Summit, together with the six-pack approved recently by the European Parliament, are a breakthrough for clear fiscal rules in our monetary union. However, the crisis hasn't ended yet. It's now important not to lose momentum and to swiftly implement all those decisions that have been taken to put the euro area economy back on course. The monetary policy measures taken last week by the ECB's Governing Council will support the flow of credit to firms and households in the euro area economy. Ludwig-Erhard faced a situation that was much more difficult than what we face today. Still, he was able to look through the challenging present and to work hard to build a future that he never doubted would be brighter. The European policymakers might well be inspired by his style. Den Strom der Zeit können wir zwar nicht lenken, aber wir werden unser Schiff sicher steuern. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ja, vielen Dank, Präsident, für diese Jungfernrede in Berlin. Sie haben ein Bild gezeichnet, das ein bisschen düster ist, das die Schwierigkeiten der aktuellen Politik, auch der Geldpolitik, sehr gut beschreibt, aber auch am Schluss doch Hoffnung geweckt hat, dass jetzt einiges in Bewegung gekommen ist. Und Sie haben Ludwig-Erhard zitiert, soziale Marktwirtschaft ist ohne Preisstabilität nicht denkbar. Wir haben nun die Gelegenheit, die sonst in erster Linie den Frankfurter geldpolitischen Journalisten überlassen ist, Herrn Draghi direkt zu befragen, sozusagen nachzuhaken, die Punkte zu vertiefen, die Ihnen am Herzen liegen. Ich werde mit einigen Fragen vorlegen und dann haben wir eine halbe Stunde Zeit, dann greife ich gerne Ihre Fragen auf. Herr Präsident, obwohl Sie geschildert haben, welche Bemühungen derzeit in Gang sind, kommen doch unverändert aus Amerika, aus dem angelsächsischen Raum, aus Teilen der Europeripherie, die Forderungen, doch jetzt eben mit der Notenpresse für eine kurzfristige große Geldschwemme zu sorgen. Woher kommt dieser Wunderglaube an die rettende Kraft einer solchen Geldschwemme?
Well, you asked me where do they get this belief? I don't know, because I mean, if you.
But you lived there.
Yeah, but I mean, by the way, what we respond to this question is the following thing, which will sound like a little, I would say, formalistic. We say that each jurisdiction is different, that we have different mandates, that the mandate of the ECB is to ensure price stability in the medium term, that we have an article prohibiting monetary financing in the treaty, and that what people call quantitative easing in other parts we call non-standard measures. That said, I don't think that if we look at the conditions of the other jurisdictions, I don't think that one sees this stellar performance of their economies because of the quantitative easing. I don't think you see stellar performances at all. I don't want to make names, but if you look at unemployment, growth, and especially inflation, you would see a picture which is certainly not better. On top of this is what I said before. Our primary deficit of the area as a whole is zero. Almost zero, and it compares with huge 5% of GDP primary deficit in the other jurisdictions. So I can't really answer your question in a sense because I don't see yet any justification to say that this strategy is superior, in fact superior to others.
Maybe in some years' time we will see which strategy was better. Sie haben jetzt mehrfach auf das Tempo hingewiesen, in dem die politischen Entscheidungen sich vollziehen. Das ist, wenn ich Sie richtig verstanden habe, aus Sicht der Notenbank eindeutig zu langsam. Es müsste schneller gehen. Die Frage ist, wenn natürlich alle gleichzeitig sehr schnell diese Reformen einleiten und auch die Sparmaßnahmen einleiten, sind wir dann nicht doch vor einer sehr schweren Rezession?
Well, I think speed is certainly essential. However, I should say it's easier. It's very easy for people who are non-elected to recommend speed. We always say that the speed of the markets, the speed required by the markets, is much greater than what our political systems can actually deliver, and this may be true, but it's an easy thing to say because you see the breach. Let me put it the other way: the breach of I would say confidence, if not trust, has taken a long time to display itself. It's first consideration. The second consideration is that wrong economic models have been in place in some countries for a long time. Some of the changes that we are advocating today imply in some countries a complete change in their social model. So to deliver this in a fast way requires that your voters, your public opinion follows you with the same speed. But this doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So we have to ask a different question. We have to recommend speed, but we should be aware of this difference in perceptions. And so we should ask ourselves, what I do while it takes time to deliver this? What do we do during this time? Second, it may be difficult to deliver in time, but what it should be less difficult is to announce a clear path of decision-making immediately. Because this would inject certainty, both in the people and in the markets. So the first thing is unambiguous statements. And I see that that is also, in fact, difficult. But there I have less understanding. but an unambiguous statement of what the right path is, and then implementation, and then delivery.
Und die Rezessionsgefahr?
Can I finally? It's true, and I did say this, that if we all do what we should do, namely in most countries, budget consolidation, debt reduction, we are going to have a short-term contraction. But one question and one answer. The question is there an alternative? And the answer is no. That's what we ought to have done a long time ago. And the second thing is there a way to mitigate this short-term contraction? And the answer is yes. With first, to some extent, the restoration of the confidence channel, where you would see the spreads going down and some confidence returning to markets and the cost of credit going down as well. But also, much more importantly, is the implementation of structural reforms, which could enhance growth and create jobs.
Wie gerichtsfest sind denn eigentlich, oh sorry. Das ist mein dritter Punkt, und dann würde ich Fragen des Publikums einbeziehen. Es wird viel geredet über die Ergebnisse des letzten Gipfels in Brüssel, und im Augenblick geht der Streit ein bisschen darum, wie gerichtsfest eigentlich das dort Beschlossene ist. Wie ist Ihr Eindruck? Ist dieser zwischenstaatliche Vertrag tatsächlich ein Weg, hinterher auch zu einer sozusagen gerichtsfesten neuen Regelung der Haushaltsdisziplin zu kommen?
Certainly the ECB is convinced that that's the right way to go. And we're also convinced that it will stand on from a legal basis. But to say that it's an easy legal path would be understating the difficulties. It's the first time, I think, that our leaders have taken this route. And so, like all first times, there is an element of exploration, of novelty in this. But the ECB analysis is pretty confident that it can be done, and also confident that what has been decided was the right thing to do at this summit.
Vielen Dank. Ich sehe im Augenblick noch keine Fragen. Dann schließe ich noch. Doch, dann fangen wir an. Und zwar zunächst bitte Herr da vorne. Stellen Sie sich bitte kurz vor und halten Sie die Frage kurz, damit wir in der Zeit, die uns zur Verfügung steht, eine halbe Stunde, möglichst viele Fragen unterbringen können.
Ja, mein Name ist Stefan Feuerstein, aber ich kann die Frage auch gerne in Englisch stellen, wenn das vielleicht...
Es muss sowieso gedolmetscht werden, insofern dürfen Sie sich das überlegen.
Yeah. So, Professor Draghi, first of all, I very much appreciate the measures you mentioned, the three measures you mentioned to help banks, commercial banks, to lend more money to corporate companies. Nevertheless, I see at present that especially bigger SMEs, not the small SMEs which are covered by, in Germany, Volksbanken, Sparkassen, etc., have already now problems to get access to enough corporate loans. Besides the three measures you mentioned, couldn't there be some kind of incentive for those banks enlarging corporate lending by leveraging their ways of refinancing towards other banks which don't do that? What I see in Germany with a lot of the big commercial banks, that they of course increase lending by financing biogas-fired plants, solar plants, wind farms, whatever, but not enlarge lending to corporate companies, especially to bigger mid-sized companies which are not covered by the already mentioned regional banking system. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Die Sorgen des Mittelstands.
No, you're absolutely right. Our surveys show that about 20% of SMEs, both large and small, state that funding and financing is their most pressing problem. So you're absolutely right. The problem is there. I think we've done a lot given this 3-year horizon to banks for financing. and we'll certainly continue monitoring the developments on this. But we should also be aware that this is only one answer to a problem which is, in a sense, very complex. There is a problem of funding, and there is a problem of risk aversion. Now, one way to say this is, I can give you as much money as you want, but if you don't want to lend this money because you don't trust, you don't have confidence that your counterparty is going to give you back the money you lent, you are not going to lend it. Now, so we should ask ourselves, what are the reasons for this increased risk aversion? Well, one reason has to do exactly with uncertainty about funding, and we have responded to that. But other reasons have to do with lack of capital, big policy uncertainty, and this is why I was referring before to the need of unambiguous, clear statements, big policy uncertainty, high volatility in the financial markets, and as I was saying before, when you have prices jumping up and down, the counterparty are always under much greater stress. So there is a general uneasiness as it was right after the Lehman Brothers case. And this is certainly not something that our measures can address. So we have responded to one part of the problem, we hope, but the restoration of confidence requires many other things besides monetary policy.
Da waren zwei weitere Fragen, und zwar der Herr da in der Mitte, die sammeln wir jetzt erst Sie, und dann da hinten die beiden Fragen, zunächst aber hier vorne. I think we'll collect 2 or 3 questions and then.
Wolfgang Hammel, State Ministry of Finance. Mr. President, let me ask you about your opinion on rating agencies. One got the impression, we are all agreed that we can't punish the messenger of bad news. But I think there was a general impression that before Lehman Brothers, the 3 agencies were very much in a passive role. And now we see the opposite. What's your view on it?
Wir sammeln das. Bitte da hinten die beiden Fragen.
Noch eine junge Welt. Mr. President, you already have bought 200 billion worth of government bonds. How many more will you buy until the treaties? Sorry?
Can you speak up?
Yeah. You already have bought 200 billion worth of government bonds. How many more will you buy until the treaties are ratified?
Okay.
And the third question on this side.
Ich stelle meine Frage in deutscher Sprache. Ralf Belliger, mein Name. Ich organisiere den Hayek-Gesprächskreis an der Universität Passau. Ich wollte sagen, wir wissen ja, dass die Finanzkrise hauptsächlich durch die Zentralbanken ausgelöst wurde, durch zu niedrige Zinsen in Amerika, die Hypothekenkrise, aber auch die Staatsanleihenkrise wurde durch zu niedrige Zinsen und auch dadurch, dass sie Staatsanleihen als Sicherheiten annehmen und dagegen Kredite vergeben, die Banken dafür kein Eigenkapital hinterlegen müssen, ausgelöst. Ich wollte fragen, was Sie von der Idee halten, als Notenbank das Geldmonopol abzuschaffen und einen Prozess hin zu einer marktwirtschaftlichen Geldordnung zu begleiten, wo wirklich jeder Investor selbst auch für seine Entscheidung haftet. Denn wenn Sie als Kreditgeber letzter Instanz Kredite vergeben, investieren Sie ja auch, aber es ist kein Eigentümer da, der persönlich haftet, und es ist auch fraglich, ob Sie das Wissen als zentrale Instanz haben, dass hier dezentrale Investoren nach meiner Ansicht zumindest besser hätten.
Vielen Dank. Dann gehen wir zu den 3 Fragen.
Okay, on rating agencies, well, I don't want to comment about the performance of rating agencies because certainly, I would say, before the crisis, certainly it could have been much better. But the main point is not our judgment about rating agencies. The main point is what do we do now? And the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, which I had the honor to chair before, incidentally, it used to be called the FSF, Financial Stability Forum, and here we have its creator and its designer, Professor Tittmeyer. This was another instance where we were together in the mid-late 90s. But the FSB had a project entitled How Do We Do Without Ratings of the Credit Rating Agencies? What can we do to get, well, not really to get rid, but to use these ratings simply as one additional input amongst many? And that's the line that we should follow. Now, here we have different actors, however. We have, first and foremost, close to us, the regulators. So the first thing is to avoid having a financial regulation which is, as we say, hardwired into ratings. So if one rating agency downgrades or upgrades someone, you immediately react with a regulatory provision changing, for example, the ratios of capital or doing things like that. So we want to avoid the hardwiring of regulation into this. Incidentally, the Dodd-Frank legislation explicitly prohibits the use of ratings by the credit rating agencies. So, but it's not easy. It basically means that you have to have internal capacity to assess credit and to produce the ratings yourself. And we are moving towards that direction, both at the ECB and also in the national central banks, and also in the banking community. Now, especially the large banks are able to assess the internal, to give internal rating assessments to their assets. But it's going to take time. And the investors community is the one that really mostly needs ratings and has the greatest difficulty to abandon the ratings. But that's the way, the way toward which we have to work. Have a world where ratings are simply one additional input in our assessments. Now the bonds. Well, we have an S&P in place, and as I said several times, it's neither eternal nor infinite. And the third question?
Would you like to abolish yourself?
Yeah, well, let me just say one thing about the crisis. I think the monetary policy was one circumstantial additional element to creating an environment where a crisis could actually erupt, as it finally eventually did. But I think the real root of the crisis has to be found in the several serious regulatory flaws in one financial jurisdiction. I think these regulatory flaws are not a one-off event. There have been flaws that have been created throughout several years, starting more or less with 2002, 2003 onward until the crisis. And this environment has created a situation where you had assets which were impossible to price correctly because they were opaque. You had a weakening of the regulatory controls of all kinds without going into too much detail. And around this, you had an abundance of liquidity coming from monetary policy, but also coming from what was called the savings glut. In other words, money flowing into the capital markets from Asia, from the Asian countries and other emerging market countries. And so again, we had a situation which is in a sense similar to what I've described before for government bonds. We had risk premia that were not reflecting the inner riskiness of the assets. In this environment, you also had excessive and misperceived leverage, that is to say, debt. In this environment of lacking transparency, very low interest rates, perverse incentives into action, you obviously had the actors raising too much debt and not even understanding how high was their debt, often, because it was concealed by the very opaqueness of the instruments they were using to raise money. So that's I think, to give an overall complete fair picture of the, I would say, of the background in which the crisis had erupted. But now, the next step is to say, how would be a world without central banks? I don't know. Frankly, you see, that's one of the things which one like me should ask, because we tend to sort of work so much into our own nest that we often avoid the big questions like, how would the world be if I didn't exist? And I don't, I'll promise I'll reflect on this. Thank you.
Sehr philosophisch.
Thank you.
Sehr diplomatisch und sehr philosophisch. Herr Kannegießer.
These emerging markets, Professor, such as China, have growing importance. They're becoming our biggest customer, our biggest competitor, and they play a growing role. What is the monetary relationship between you and the central bodies in these emerging markets such as China, and can they be tied into the multilateral system, which was the big progress we had after the war? And are they helpful? Can we keep a balance? Can you keep them in balance with all our problems? Or is this rather encouraging that the system further will be in danger to fall apart?
Vielen Dank.
Thank you. That's a difficult question. I should say first that collaboration with the monetary policy authorities of these China and the other countries is actually very good. We meet periodically in the BIS in Basel, in the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, and where we have intense and full exchanges of views about economic policies and candid exchanges of views about economic policy and monetary economic policy especially. And it's a candor that we highly appreciate, of course, because sometimes informations are hard to flow often. So from that viewpoint, I should say that the state of collaboration is fair. However, I think one should never forget that the institutional setup in which monetary policy takes place in these countries is very, very different from ours. And one should never forget, in a sense, that even the banking lending channel acts in a completely different way. To some extent, one should say also that they really, there is a good collaboration. It's actually producing results in some areas. For example, in the regulatory and supervisory area, China and the other emerging markets have been players like other countries in the establishment of Basel III, in the establishment of new rules of supervision. So, and now they have agreed to, like all the others really, to be subject to I would say, implementation, to be subject to being supervised on how well they are implementing these new rules within the FSB and the G20. So,
sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I have two more questions on this side.
Okay.
So, zunächst Herr Gerster und dann der Herr da hinten, bitte.
Ich möchte gern an die Frage von Herrn Kannegießer anknüpfen und mehr volkswirtschaftlich, also nicht geldpolitisch, den Zentralbanker, sondern den volkswirtschaftlichen Player fragen. Können wir aus der Statistik, die gestern in der FAZ veröffentlicht war, dass China 3-mal so viel in Europa direkt investiert als in Nordamerika, 3-mal so viel in Europa als in Nordamerika, schließen, dass wir im weltweiten Kräftegleichgewicht wirtschaftlich auf mittlere Sicht, aus Sicht von China, doch eigentlich ganz gut dastehen. Im Gegensatz zu Obamas Äußerungen, wir sind eine pazifische Nation, also er wendet sich nach Asien von Europa ab. Gibt es da einen Widerspruch oder ist das Kaffeesatzleserei?
Wir nehmen die zweite Frage bitte noch dazu. Dann.
Mr. President, my name is Stefan Ernst of Bild-Zeitung. You are standing below a quotation from Ludwig-Erhard concerning inflation, which is probably one of the things that are most interesting to many people in Germany. And you are known for standing in the Bundesbank tradition of price stability. You said that yourself. And you know also at the beginning of your term as the ECB president that former Bundesbank presidents have been measured, their success have been measured, whether or not they were able to harness inflation. So my question is, can you promise here and now that you will be able to press the inflation rate again towards the 2% ceiling? And if not, what kind of inflation rate will prevail in Eurozone and Germany in the years to come?
Vielen Dank.
Well, the first question really is, why are the Chinese investing so much in Europe and with respect even to the United States? Well, one should know, however, whether these investments are, I would say, market-based investments or are investments made by sovereign wealth funds or other things. But suppose that, let's assume they are market-based investments. Well, one reason is that what comes to mind is that the Chinese have already accumulated so much dollar-denominated assets that for simply diversification reasons, they would like to diversify into European investments. Another reason is, in a sense, that probably they estimate the long-term return of these investments. If we are talking about foreign direct investments and not portfolio investments, they probably estimate the long-term return of these investments superior to investments, to the rate of return elsewhere, and especially in the US. The third reason that comes to mind, however, has to do with an element that I cannot really gauge in a precise way. I'll be clear. Suppose that these investments come from a government-owned entity, and they follow not an economic logic. Then I wouldn't know why they're here and not in another part of the world. But I would say that the first 2 or 3 reasons that I gave would explain some of this difference. On the inflation rate, absolutely. The answer is yes, absolutely. The profile that we see now in inflation is an inflation hovering around 3% for the euro area. Due to essentially one-off events like an increase in the oil price and an increase in commodity price and especially increases in indirect taxation. And these are one-off effects, and we see a profile of inflation which will decline to 2% by year-end next year, 2012, and then it would stay below 2% in 2013 and onward.
Vielen Dank. Das ist sozusagen das Berliner Versprechen der Stabilität von Präsident Draghi. Wir werden uns das gerne merken. Ich habe auch noch eine Frage. In Deutschland hat die Staatsschuldenkrise paradoxerweise, wie ich finde, eine neue Kapitalismusdebatte, Kapitalismuskritik ausgelöst. Haben Sie dafür Verständnis, dass nun dem Markt angelastet wird, was doch überwiegend die Politik zu verantworten hat? Dass dem Markt angelastet wird, was die Politik eigentlich zu verantworten hat. Das heißt, es gibt eine sehr starke, steigende Kapitalismusdebatte in Deutschland und ich glaube in den anderen Ländern auch. Es ist nicht nur Occupy, das geht auch in die intellektuellen Zirkel. Herr Kampeter, wenn Sie noch was sagen wollen, sagen Sie es gleich, dann ist die Zeit zu Ende, sonst nicht frech aus der ersten Reihe rufen. So.
No, I think no, I think I'm not you know, in answering this question, one goes by instinct, really, rather than hard data. And you have two categories of people. One that believes that everything is the fault of a market conspiracy, and others believe that it's never the fault of market conspiracies because they don't believe in market conspiracies. I think that neither of these is right. In other words, if you make mistakes in policies, if you create uncertainty, if you increase volatility, all these are conditions where, in a sense, certain segments of the markets could actually make profits. And if you have a stability in place, if you make, as I said before, unambiguous statements about your policy intentions, if you have a monetary policy geared to price stability in the medium term, if you have a stable environment like the one that Ludwig-Erhard has worked all his life for, you see that there isn't much speculation, much market speculation to blame. So the two things. It's also true, another thing, that it's very difficult to explain to people, ordinary people, why this is happening to them. But this is not my job, it's the politician's job.
Yeah, and the journalists, I feel.
And the journalists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Wir sind ans Ende der Zeit. Just one word. Wir sind ans Ende unserer Zeit angekommen. Ich habe vielleicht eine ganz kurze Anekdote, die ich gerne erzählen würde. Ich habe eine Tante, 80 Jahre, sie ist Italienerin, und als bekannt wurde, dass Mario Draghi der neue EZB-Präsident werden würde, hat sie mir eine Postkarte geschrieben, hat geschrieben: Wir schicken euch unseren besten Mann. Wir sind sehr traurig. Ich denke, wir konnten hier heute sehen und uns selbst ein Bild machen. Vielen Dank dafür und vielen Dank Ihnen fürs Fragen und Zuhören. Jetzt hat Herr Pellengar das Schlusswort.
Thank you.